It is the morning of May 7th, 1943, on a stretch of empty sand at Westward Ho in North Devon. The tide has just turned, and a small crowd of senior officers, scientists, and a handful of journalists stand well back behind a rope, watching something extraordinary trundle towards them across the beach. It is roughly 3 meters tall, built from 2 enormous wooden wheels, each weighing several hundred kilograms, connected by a steel drum packed with high explosive. Strapped around the rims of the wheels are dozens of rocket motors, hissing and spitting orange flame, propelling the entire contraption forward at what witnesses later describe as an alarming and unpredictable speed. It is meant to travel in a straight line, climb a beach, smash through coastal defenses, and detonate against a concrete wall with the force of nearly 2 tons of explosive. Instead, on this particular morning, one of its rocket motors detaches itself from the rim, and the whole machine begins to turn. It does not slow down. It does not stop. It simply changes direction and comes hurtling back towards the watching dignitaries who scatter across the dunes in their uniforms, diving for cover as the burning wheel veers past them and crashes into the sea. Nobody is killed. Nobody, remarkably, is even seriously hurt. But the device responsible for this near catastrophe has a name that sounds almost like a joke, and for decades afterwards, very few people outside a small circle of military planners would even know it had existed. It was called the Great Panjandrum, and the full story of what it was built to do, how it nearly worked, and why its existence remained sealed away in classified files for the best part of 60 years, says a great deal about the strange, desperate, brilliant improvisation that characterized Britain's war effort. This is the story of one of the oddest weapons ever built by a nation at war, and why understanding its failure tells us more about wartime ingenuity than almost any of its successes. By 1943, Britain's military planners were grappling with a problem that had no obvious solution. The eventual invasion of occupied Europe, whenever and wherever it came, would have to cross open beaches directly into the teeth of Germany's Atlantic Wall, a sprawling system of coastal fortifications that Hitler had ordered built along thousands of kilometers of European coastline. These defenses included thick, reinforced concrete seawalls, some more than 2 meters high and almost as thick, designed specifically to stop tanks, vehicles, and infantry from ever gaining a foothold beyond the tide line. Aerial bombing had proven frustratingly unreliable against these structures. Bombs dropped from altitude scattered widely and rarely struck with the precision needed to breach a concrete wall, while naval gunfire, though more accurate, could not always be brought close enough inshore without exposing ships to mines and shore batteries. Engineers calculated that a single section of sea wall, the kind found at Normandy and elsewhere, might require several tons of explosive delivered with pinpoint accuracy to create a gap wide enough for tanks and vehicles to pass through. The trouble was obvious. How do you get several tons of explosive across an open beach, under fire, without using a vehicle that the enemy could simply target and destroy long before it reached its objective? Conventional engineering vehicles were too slow, too vulnerable, and too easily disabled by a single well-placed shell. What was needed was something that could carry a devastating payload across open sand at speed, present a difficult target, and detonate exactly where it was needed, all without risking a single human life in the process. It needed to be cheap enough to build in large numbers, since planners assumed many would be destroyed before reaching their targets, and simple enough that it could be manufactured quickly using materials and workshops that were not already committed to higher priority war production. No existing piece of British, American, or German engineering came close to meeting this brief, and for a time, the problem appeared to planners at Combined Operations Headquarters to be close to insoluble. It was in this atmosphere of mounting frustration that someone suggested an answer so unconventional that, on paper, it barely sounds like a serious proposal at all. The man most closely associated with the idea was Neville Shute Norway, an aeronautical engineer and novelist who worked for the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, a unit nicknamed within Whitehall as the Weezers and Dodgers for its reputation for producing eccentric but occasionally brilliant solutions to seemingly impossible problems. The department was based partly at the Admiralty and drew on engineering talent and workshops scattered across the country, including facilities at HMS Birnbeck near Weston-super-Mare, a disused Victorian pier that had been requisitioned for weapons testing. The core idea that emerged from this group was deceptively simple. Instead of building a vehicle with an engine, gearbox, and driver, why not build something closer to an enormous cartwheel, using the wheel's own diameter and momentum to roll across sand far more efficiently than any tracked or wheeled vehicle could manage? 2 steel-rimmed wooden wheels, each around 3 meters across, would be connected by a central steel drum containing the explosive charge. Around the rim of each wheel, engineers fitted cordite rocket motors, the same basic propulsion technology used in naval signal rockets, angled to fire in sequence and spin the wheels forward like an enormous accelerating hoop. The theory was elegant. A large diameter wheel rolls more smoothly over uneven and soft ground than smaller wheels do, distributing weight over a wider contact area, much as a bicycle copes better with rough terrain than a skateboard. By mounting rocket motors directly onto the rims rather than relying on a separate engine, the designers avoided the need for any conventional drivetrain, dramatically simplifying construction. In principle, dozens of rockets firing in carefully timed bursts would send the entire assembly rolling up a beach at speeds approaching 100 kilometers per hour, smashing into a seawall and detonating its main charge, all without a crew member anywhere near the danger zone. The device weighed close to 2 tons, fully loaded, stood roughly 3.5 meters tall at the wheel rims, and was designed to be steered, at least in theory, using ropes or cables that operators on a following landing craft could tug to correct its course as it ran. Early versions used 18 rocket motors. Later models, in the search for greater stability, used as many as 70. The drum at the center, where the explosive payload sat, could hold the equivalent of around 2 tons of high explosive, comparable to a small bomb capable of demolishing a substantial section of reinforced wall in a single detonation. Construction took place using requisitioned workshops and timber yards in the West Country, with prototype wheels built from laminated wood reinforced with steel banding, since wood proved cheaper, lighter, and more readily available than steel for components of that size during a period when metal was in desperately short supply for the wider war effort. Production numbers remain difficult to confirm precisely, since most records relating to the project were destroyed or remained sealed for decades, but surviving accounts suggest only a small number of complete units, likely fewer than 10, were ever actually built and tested. What followed was a series of trials that have since become almost legendary among military historians for their sheer unpredictability. The fundamental flaw in the Panjandrum's design lay in its rocket motors. Cordite rockets of the period were notoriously inconsistent in their burn rates and thrust output, meaning that even small variations between individual motors could cause uneven propulsion around the wheel's circumference. If rockets on one side burned slightly faster or detached from their mountings, which happened with troubling regularity, the entire device would begin to veer, and once it began turning, the laws of physics meant it tended to keep turning, often in increasingly wild and unpredictable arcs. During trials at Westward Ho throughout the spring of 1943, the Panjandrum was tested repeatedly on the open beach, and accounts from those present describe scenes that swung between genuine menace and outright farce. On one occasion, a dog reportedly chased after the burning rolling machine as it careered across the sand, narrowly avoiding disaster. On another, the device broke apart entirely, scattering still-burning rocket motors in all directions across the beach while observers dived for cover behind sand dunes and parked vehicles. The trial, on May 7, 1943, attended by senior officers and a small group of journalists under strict secrecy, produced perhaps the most dramatic failure of all, when a detached rocket sent the entire assembly into a sweeping turn directly towards the assembled spectators, who scattered in what one account later described, with characteristic understatement, as ungainly haste. No version of the Panjandrum is recorded as ever having been used in actual combat. The technical problems with stability and steering were never adequately solved despite repeated modifications, including attempts to fit a stabilizing third wheel and adjustments to rocket placement and sequencing. By late 1943, as planning for the eventual invasion of Normandy intensified and alternative methods of breaching coastal defenses, including specially adapted tanks known collectively as Hobart's Funnies, proved more reliable, the Panjandrum project was quietly abandoned. It never reached the beaches it was designed to attack, and the men responsible for its development moved on to other, ultimately more successful projects. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to come about Britain's stranger wartime inventions. It would be easy to dismiss the Panjandrum as nothing more than an embarrassing footnote, but viewed alongside the genuinely successful innovations being developed in parallel, it reveals something important about the climate of wartime engineering. Germany pursued its own remote and unconventional weapons during this period, most notably the Goliath tracked mine, a small remote-controlled demolition vehicle roughly the size of a large dog, which carried explosive charges of up to 100 kilograms and was steered by an operator using a cable, allowing German forces to detonate it against fortifications or armored vehicles from a safe distance. The Goliath was simpler, more controllable, and was actually used operationally on multiple fronts, though its slow speed and vulnerability to small arms fire meant it achieved only limited practical success. The Americans, meanwhile, experimented with various remote demolition concepts but generally favored more conventional engineering solutions, relying heavily on combat engineers using Bangalore torpedoes, explosive-packed tubes that could be pushed under barbed wire and obstacles by hand, a far less ambitious but considerably more dependable approach. What distinguishes the Panjandrum from both of these alternatives is its scale of ambition relative to its technical reliability. The Goliath, however limited, generally went where its operator steered it. The Panjandrum, by contrast, was never reliably steerable at all, and its enormous explosive payload, intended as its greatest strength, became its greatest danger, since an uncontrolled 2-ton explosive charge rolling at speed posed as much risk to the men deploying it as to any enemy position. In this sense, the comparison is not flattering to the British design, though it is worth noting that the Panjandrum represented a more radical conceptual leap, attempting to solve the steering and propulsion problem through pure mechanical elegance rather than remote electrical control, an approach that, had the rocket motor inconsistency problem been solved, might genuinely have offered advantages in cost and simplicity over more electronically dependent systems. The actual historical impact of the Great Panjandrum is, by any honest assessment, almost entirely negligible in material terms. It never fired in anger, never breached a single meter of enemy fortification, and contributed no destructive force whatsoever to the eventual liberation of Europe. Its significance lies instead in what it represents about the sheer breadth of experimentation that British wartime planners were willing to fund and pursue, often in parallel with dozens of other projects, most of which similarly failed to reach operational service. For every successful innovation that emerged from departments such as the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, including genuinely effective inventions like the Hedgehog anti-submarine mortar or various specialized armored vehicles, there were numerous failed experiments that never proceeded beyond prototype stage, the Panjandrum simply being among the most visually spectacular and, in retrospect, most amusing of these failures. Details of the trials remained officially classified for decades after the war, partly through ordinary bureaucratic inertia surrounding wartime weapons research generally, and partly, some historians have suggested, out of simple institutional embarrassment at how badly the public demonstrations had gone. It was not until the 1970s and beyond that fuller accounts of the testing began to circulate publicly, drawing on the recollections of surviving participants and a small amount of declassified documentation, and even today many of the precise technical specifications and production figures remain difficult to verify with complete confidence. Surviving photographic and film footage of the Westward Ho trials, some of it captured for internal military assessment rather than public release, has since become a popular curiosity among military history enthusiasts, frequently cited as an example of British wartime ingenuity taken slightly too far. No complete original Panjandrum is known to survive today, though a faithful working replica was built decades later for a televised history program, which, in a pleasing echo of the original trials, also reportedly proved difficult to keep traveling in a straight line. Return for a moment to that beach at Westward Ho in May 1943, to the sand, the smoke, and the scattering officers diving for cover from a machine that was meant to be Britain's answer to an impossible problem.